Welcome to Swami Reacts. Today we will be exploring Eager to Love, the alternative way of Francis of Assisi by Father Richard Rohr. Everything that Father Richard writes is amazing. I'm biased towards him, as you know. This is a beautiful book I've read recently, especially while preparing my heart and mind and every of my faculties for a recent visit to Assisi. Second time I had the fortune of visiting the birthplace of St. Francis in Italy. So this book came, and recently I've heard a few months before that whole podcast done by the CAC, Center for Action and Contemplation, studying this particular book. And of course, they say you don't need to read the book to follow this podcast. But after following the podcast, the first thing I felt is I want to read the book, which in this case is not so much a biography of the life of Francis, but specifically an analysis of his heart, I will say, as Father Richard will always masterfully do, in a very practical, relatable, deep way. So I felt inspired to share some words about this particular work. About this particular figure of St. Francis, which probably more than almost any other saint in any tradition represents this sense of universal divine communion, connection, non-sectarian, beyond institutionalization, in deep embrace with creation, in deep embrace with the divine, and so on and so forth. So it's a very inspiring figure, I will say, for all of us, no matter our background. And very interestingly, the book almost starts with a very related note to my recent book, Evolution in Divine Love, where Richard is saying that much of Francis' genius was that he was ready for absolute newness from God, and therefore could also trust fresh and new attitudes in himself. Beautiful. If I would have read that before publishing my book, that will be part of it. So Francis was always welcoming ever freshness, ever newness from the sweet absolute, and that in turn allowed him to trust freshness in himself, to trust inspiration, to trust intuition, new attitudes, new discoveries, new unfolding, because knowing that the whole pattern of reality is one of constant growth and expansion. And you can see that from the way he lived his life, so spontaneously, so organically, so lovingly, and so at wonder, at surprise, at marvel with creation. And of course, in the context of speaking about Francis' life, and Father Richard Rohr is a Franciscan friar himself, so of course Francis is his main father figure, if you want to put it that way. Father Richard presents many of his classical points, which of course come as a sweet inheritance from Francis, like the beyond, as he will say, is not really beyond, but in the depths of here. So that's another way of transcendence being seen as further depth, not as evacuation plan, not as a denial, indifference, or escape from the immediacy of the here and now, but as a further excavation project of where we already are right now, right here. Richard will say, the realization that the concrete opens you up to the universal might be the only fully trustworthy or possible path anyway, because that is how sensate humans normally operate. The realization that the concrete, the immediate, the world of matter, if you will, opens us up to the universal. Again, a very clear pattern in other traditions. Our tradition included Gaudiya Vaishnavism, where the main lessons are Virat Rupa, learn to relate to this world as a form of God, a very panentheistic notion. God in everything, everything in God. We are existing in that sacred womb. Everything is being hosted. God is in us, we are in God. And Francis embodied that more than anyone, probably, in how he, again, communed with nature. He was beyond certain rules and regulations. He never openly challenged the status quo of the church, which at that time was very much revolving around power and hierarchy. But the whole challenge came naturally by the way he was living his life radically in love with God. So Richard will mention that Francis' liberated body in touch with everything is itself his primary message. What a beautiful poetic way of putting that. Francis' liberated body, fully spiritualized body, in touch with everything, hidden matter, embracing animals, embracing the leper, having the Pope falling at his feet and kissing it. That's his primary message. How he walked the earth, how he conducted himself as an acharya, someone who teaches by precept or example. And how we embrace daily death to embrace a new life at every moment. Richard will speak about that in the book as well. How once death is joyfully incorporated into our life, we are already in heaven, and there is no possibility of fear or hell, or of fear or of hell. So incorporation of death in life equals heaven. In other words, equals fearlessness. Dying before we die. Not accumulating the undied deaths of every day that passes till the official moment of biological death comes, and all those unlived or undied deaths, as you wish to put it, come to us all together. And in terms of dying to things, releasing things also has to do with accepting certain things that go beyond our control. And in this connection, Richard will say something very interesting. He says to accept some degree of meaninglessness is our final and full act of faith that God is still good and still in control. That doesn't mean that there's no meaning, but we cannot grasp what's the meaning of whatever may be happening. The final and full gift of meaning is ironically, the incorporation of no meaning and not knowing. So the full knowing is allowing the unknowing, allowing to not know certain things, allowing to coexist with eternal mystery forever and be nourished by that unknowing, not only tolerating that, bearing it, but be nourished by that, being fed by that, be nursed by mystery. And again, many times the opposite happens in the name of religion, unfortunately. We create an overdose of trust in externals, of trust in laws and institutions and outer figures of authority, which I'm not saying all of that is bad, but we create an overdose-like emphasis in that, which disempowers our natural intuition to coexist with mystery and trust ourselves. So that's what also Richard mentions here, and that Francis very deeply embodied. Very much of organized religion, he says, without meaning to, has actually discouraged us from taking the mystical path by telling us almost exclusively to trust outer authority, scripture, tradition, or various kinds of experts, what I call the containers, Richard will say, instead of telling us the value of unimportance of inner experience itself, which is the content versus the container. So if in our tradition, of course, we also have Guru, Shastra, and Sadhu, spiritual mentor, saintly people, sacred scriptures, and those are crucial, but they are not to replace personal experience. They are to facilitate personal experience. Guru is our own potential appearing in front of us to invite us to do whatever we need to do to experience what we need to experience. So at the end of the day, it's not enough to quote scripture. It's not enough to be initiated with one particular guru and claim loyalty to this line or that group. But at the end of the day, what makes the difference is pratyaksha avagamam dharmyam, Krishna says in the Gita. This is understood through personal experience alone. And Richard, in that sense, says that Franciscan mysticism, the central practice, speaking about a practice which takes us to experience, he said the central practice of Franciscan mysticism is that we must remain in love. Interesting way of putting it, right? Remain in love with everything. Of course, in the beginning, it doesn't flow organically, and we may do to make an effort and sacrifice and follow some rules and this and that. But all that is with the purpose of taking us to a place where we can be in love with everything, falling in love with everything, ultimately. Trying to live, as we say, a contemplative life, a mystical life means inside the temple, realizing everything is a temple, everything is sacred, everything can be loved from one place or another. Passionate love, compassionate love, any other forms of love in between. And from there we serve the world. In the words of Father Richard will be, live inside the universal mystery of the church and woe and serve the world. But he will say most Christians got it backward, and they live in the world and occasionally go to church. We can, of course, translate that, replacing church with temple or whatever word you want to use for your tradition. So someone like Saint Francis was someone who emphasized doing, not like human doing and workaholic stuff, but you have to live out your beliefs in how you live your life, how you walk on earth, how you relate to others, how you move, what do you do with your body? So he was famous to tell by telling his friars, you only know as much as you do. So in other words, you have to do something with that information. You have to live out, play out that information in the terms of concrete actions, transformative actions, not only informative, the accumulation, so to say. In that sense, Richard refers to Francis and Clare's. He also speaks about Saint Clare of Assisi, of course. The approach could be called performative spirituality, but not in a negative sense. They are performing, making a show, but things are to be found, are only found to be true in the doing of them. Again, it's such temptation to fill our minds with concepts and ideas and opinions and assumptions and beliefs and values, but how much we're acting out each of them. Many times just receiving information is another form of spiritual bypassing and an art that we need to get rid of. So we need to keep not only our head and our heart balanced, our head, heart, and body properly aligned, properly engaged. That will be a way to understand bhakti, jnana, and karma, if you will. Heart, intellect, and body. Thoughts, words, actions, whatever, all in line. And the world needs those teachers, right? If you want to share something with someone, it's not enough that you're a charismatic leader, you are a scholar in your particular discipline, you have so much to say. Of course, there will still be people falling for that. But as one of the popes said, and Richard quotes him, he said, the world will no longer believe teachers unless they are first of all witnesses. So we have to embrace what the Srimad Bhagavatam calls Shakshitva, witnesshood, bearing witness to reality, living our beliefs, embodying, incarnating, something very embodied. As one Srivatsa Goswami told me, bhakti is carnal. It's very carnal, very embodied, very in the here and now, very in the immediacy. So that's how we can show what we believe in, actually, not by what we say, but how we act out our convictions, our ideals. Also, of course, a few more words. Richard here explores Clare, as I say, the principle of Clare of Assisi, the principle of the divine feminine in many directions. He shares a very interesting quote from Eric Fromm about our conception of the divine in terms of gender that I'd like to share with you. He says, the character of the love of God depends on the respective weight that each group gives to the matriarchal and patriarchal aspects of religion. So depending how balanced we have this yin and yang, this polarity, the character of the love of God will depend on that. How we see God, how we perceived God's love in our life will depend on how balanced we have divine feminine, divine masculine, goddess and God, and healthy versions of both of them, of course. And then at the end of the book, Richard goes to examine briefly the lives of some very famous Franciscans like Bonaventure, who will say, seek grace, not instruction, desire, not understanding. What else? Seek the groaning of prayer over diligent reading, seek the spouse more than the teacher, seek God, not man, darkness, not clarity, not light, but the fire itself. He's the famous one who said, Bonaventure, God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And Srila Siddhar Maharaj will love to quote that. In the beginning, I thought it was a quote of Srila Siddhar Maharaj when I first heard it, and then I realized, he's quoting a Franciscan theologian, Saint Bonaventure. God is a circle whose center is everywhere. Try to imagine that. Try to visualize that internally. He's everywhere. The center is everywhere. Perfection is everywhere. Richard will then also explore briefly the life of John Duns Scotus, another famous Franciscan theologian who will speak about things like the univocity of being, the one voiceness of being, which gives a philosophical foundation to now what nowadays we call holons, or a holarchy. I don't know if you heard, I refer to that in my book. Ken Wilber will also use that. We live in a holographic universe where everything is a holon. Now, what's a holon? The part contains the whole or replicates the whole, and yet each part has a wholeness within itself. We can think of that as God and the universe and bodies inside the universe and other ingredients inside the body, and each of them is whole in unto itself, but part of a greater whole. Om Purnamada Purnamidam, we will say in our tradition. So anyhow, this is a very beautiful book. Again, it may not be the typical biographical work on St. Francis, and there are so many of them. I think he's the saint that he has the most biographical works about him. So it's good that we have something that explores his intent and heart beyond the biographical details. And Richard makes that brilliant as usual, presenting Francis as a living answer to those who are asking the right questions. He will say Francis really does not have much of a systematic answers to theological questions, but he himself is a living answer if we are sincere enough and have the right questions. He's a transformed people who transforms people. That's how it works. Transformed people, Richard will say, transforms people. And he concludes one section that I will recommend if you go to the book, to a section that he speaks about imagination. Very interesting section. I won't go into the details here, that may be too much, but he speaks about our inner imaginarium. He will say if your inner imaginarium is rich, intelligent, not overly defended, you will never stop growing spiritually. And yeah, lots of words about love. Let me conclude with one quote from Love that he says beautifully. He says, when you die, you are precisely the capacity you have developed to give and receive love. I will read that again. When you die, you are precisely the capacity you have developed to give and to receive love. Your recognition of this is your own final judgment of yourself, which means you become responsible for what you now see. Not shamed or even rewarded, but just responsible, response-able. Krishna will say, Jam Jamba Pishmarambaram. How you live this world is how you enter the next chapter of the journey. So we are invited to a further journey for sure with this book, Eager to Love, the alternative way, alternative orthodoxy of Francis of Assisi by Father Richard Rohr, another recommended one in Swami Reacts. Thank you for joining. I'm looking forward to see you soon in our next meeting.